Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I'd review this little YouTube short and talk about this topic that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And of course, for anyone that's been watching my channel now for, a little while, and anyone, of course, who's been paying attention to that of the sport of boxing, we all know the colossal fight that everyone is talking about that's right on the horizon. And of course, the fight that I'm talking about is the Terence Bud Crawford versus Saul Canelo Alvarez fight, which I believe happens on the date of September 13th. Now that I think about it, I'm not actually sure who else is on that card, but I'd have to overall see who else is on that card. I believe that it's going to be a decent card, but I'll have to see. But anyways, the reason why I wanted to do this video is because it was a very little interesting conversation or little game that they kind of played with that of a Terence Bud Crawford. And of course, Terence Bud Crawford, I do think realizes that not only is he facing a great fighter, but that he's also facing an all-time great level fighter. And I think that Canelo Alvarez realizes that as well. I think that they both realize that, what they both bring to the table and that they're both not just great, but both all-time level greats in my personal view. And many people have asked me, or at least a few people as of recent have kind of asked me, and stated, or they've asked me, who are your top 20 to top 30 greatest boxers of all time? Who would be on your personal list? Well, I thought that this would be kind of the perfect opportunity to kind of, maybe not reveal all of my top 20 or top 30, because to be fair, I don't have an exact lock or, anything that isn't necessarily that fluid in terms of that, because in my personal view, especially in an individual sport, but especially in that of boxing, because there's so many things that are a little bit of subjective. You can kind of debate the resume or what accomplishments you think are better or all this other stuff. And of course, the skill set in certain people's eyes is also a little bit subjective as well. But I will be talking about, in my personal view, who I think some of the greater fighters of all time are, who would probably be within my top 10 or top 20. And of course, where both Terence Bud Crawford and Canelo Alvarez could be on my all-time great list. Now, if you're asking me personally, I've already stated this that in my personal view, that Canelo Alvarez and Terence Bud Crawford, that they're both on a similar level in my view, that they're both all-time level greats. Now, who would I probably put over the other, just in terms of all-time greats, just compared with everything? I probably would put Canelo Alvarez, in more of the all-time great conversation, at least further up to totem pole than what I would at Crawford, just because of his all-around resume and the fact, of course, that he's been able to win in two weight classes that, to be quite honest with you, if there was another fighter of his stature, that they probably would have not really been champions then. I mean, many people, of course, want to go in this mirage, or excuse me, not mirage. I mean, I guess you can call that if you want to, but they want to go on this narrative that Canelo Alvarez, that when he unified 168, that it was his quote unquote weak division. And there's nothing weak about Billy Joe Saunders, nor Caleb Plant, nor Callum Smith. All those guys were looked at the very least as A-minus level fighters. We've seen Callum Smith still do recently very well at the light heavyweight division. He dominated his last fight against a great, undefeated, young up-and-coming talent at the light heavyweight division. And of course, Caleb Plant had a decent career, gave David Benavidez one of his tougher fights, although of course he did lose recently. And Billy Joe Saunders, he was someone that may have not had the best of resumes, but he was very talented and decently skilled. And Billy Joe Saunders, I mean, his career basically was over after Canelo Alvarez, ended up knocking him out. But I mean, it is what it is, or breaking his orbital eye bone. Now, Crawford, of course, he doesn't have the worst resume that I've ever seen, but what I will state is that, as I've already stated, he only has, in my personal view, about 5 A-grade level names. I think he has Sean Porter. I think he has that, of an Israel Madrimov. I think he has that of a Victor Postal, a Yuriorkis Gamboa, and of course the biggest win of his career, Errol Spence Jr., which of course is still a pretty decent resume. I just don't think that it's as many A-grade level names as some other fighters. But of course, if Crawford ends up winning this fight against Canelo Alvarez, all that narrative is really going to change around. Even though I don't think that either fighter is necessarily at their peak anymore, I don't think that Crawford is necessarily at his best either. I think that he's older, I think that he's slower, and of course he's also moving up at a weight class that he's never personally been at before. So Canelo Alvarez does need to win this fight, of course, if he still wants to keep a lot of his legacy intact. It will do a lot for both of their legacies. And in my personal view, where would I rank both Crawford and Canelo Alvarez? They at the very least will be within my top 20 to top 30 pound for pound of all time, at least within that of the past 60 years. When you talk about fighters, probably from the 60s onwards. Now, when you talk about the fighters from a little bit more earlier on, if you want to talk about guys like Joe Louis and what's his name, Rocky Marcianos, other guys like that, probably then on, even from the 50s onwards, Sugar Ray Robinson, of course. Now, when you get to the era of a Jack Johnson or Jack Dempsey, that one is a little bit harder to rank, especially because at times there were certain times where the decisions, they could be completely, kind of very controversial or biased. I think that they had newspaper decisions. And on top of that, they also had times where certain colored heavyweight champions or, Caucasian, quote unquote heavyweight champions, they couldn't face each other because they had different titles back then. So they couldn't really face each other to figure out who was the best of the best. So, for example, during Jack Dempsey's time, he would have never been able to face someone like a Sam Langford or someone else like that, or a Joe Louis, because they basically weren't allowed to. But anyways, the point is that, so it's a little bit harder to compare there, but I will be talking about some of the greater fighters of all time. But this video was very particularly interesting because Terence Bud Crawford, he was asked a question, I believe, by this little interviewer here, and he brought up several different boxers, and he told Terence Bud Crawford to speak up when he believes, that there's a boxer that he mentions that is greater or better than Canelo Alvarez. And not only will I be talking a little bit about boxing within this, video, but also be talking about some of the other sports that I watch as well. And I'll be giving some of my Mount Rushmores, at least in terms of what weight classes or what sport that I'm talking about, yada yada, certain stuff like that. But anyways, that being stated, let's get into the video. Let's see what Mr. Terence Bud Crawford has to say. I thought that it was a very particularly interesting video.
Name a bunch of boxers. You don't talk until you hear a better boxer that I name. So for Canelo Alvarez, Carl Froch.
Just to talk about Carl Froch very quickly, and I'm going to be talking about each one of the boxers that he mentions. Carl Froch, although especially a lot of American people, and I was born in America, but I do know a certain amount of the British boxing history. But anyways, the point is that many people, they may actually underlook Carl Froch a little bit. I actually think that Carl Froch has been a little bit more of the underrated fighters, probably of the past 20 plus years. Is he someone that I would call an all-time great? I mean, it's definitely a debate. I would say that, he's probably an all-time great. I would say that he probably just slips into that conversation, and certain people overall may disagree with me, but I would say that he's just right there. Carl Froch did get some great wins in his career, and it wasn't just, over George Groves or certain guys like that. He did get the win over the undefeated George Groves, who I believe was a 1 or 2-time champion in his career. He also was able to get a rematch victory over Mikhail Kessler. He also was able to get a victory over the undefeated Lucien Boutet, who at the time was looked at as a top level fighter in boxing, or at least as a top guy. He was a champion, I believe, for a few fights, and then Carl Froch went in there and I believe knocked him out within a few rounds. So that one, of course, has to count. He also defeated Jean Pascal, who's probably about A- at his absolute best. He's not a tremendous fighter, but he is someone that has gotten a few great wins in his career, was able to get a draw against Bernard Hopkins in the first fight, although an older version of Hopkins, and I believe he was also able to get a slight victory over that of a Marcus Brown, who was an A-grade level talent and A-grade level fighter in my personal view. So point is that Carl Froch actually did get some great wins in his career. Of course, he also has that win over Jermaine Taylor. He also has several title defenses in the weight class. The only fighter that he never defeated in his career was that of an Andre S.O.G. Ward, because of course they never ended up rematching, and Andre Ward is debatably, in my personal view, the greatest 168-pounder of all time. So when we take a look at Carl Froch, in my personal view, he would be someone that I would label as an all-time great level fighter, just in my personal view. Just in my view, and I know that not everyone is going to agree with that. A lot of people probably don't even know who Carl Froch, or I'm not going to say that a lot of people don't know who Carl Froch is, but a lot of people may not know quite the career of a Carl Froch. But in my view, he is an all-time great level fighter. Is he someone that I would ever place within my top 20 or top 30 of all time? No, but he's someone that maybe if you take a look at his career, maybe could make the top 50, top 60, top 70. And then this is what I mean overall by all-time great level fighters. Now, many people would not consider Carl Froch an all-time great level fighter. In my personal view, there are all-time great level fighters. You could even debate that there are 100 fighters that are all-time great level fighters. To me, it's not just the top 10 or the top 20 of all time. Now, when you talk about quote-unquote GOAT level, Carl Froch is not there. He's not, he's not within that realm. There's GOAT level in my personal view, which is top 10 or top 20. Then after that, you kind of have, right under there. Then there's another level after that. Carl Froch would be probably in about, the fourth or the fifth tier, away from that. He's not someone that would be on GOAT level, nowhere near, but he's someone that, in my view, definitely is an A-grade level fighter. He's someone that, in terms of boxing skill, he actually was a lot more skilled than what people give him credit for. He was a decent boxer. They called him the Cobra, I believe. He was someone that kind of fought in that style, more of a counter-punching style. He also had one of the best dual-wielded power punches that I've ever seen. He had a great left hook. He also had a great right cross. If Carl Froch hit you, it was possibly over. He was someone that was extremely gifted athletically. He wasn't the fastest fighter, but he wasn't extremely slow, and he also was extraordinarily strong. Someone with a great chin as well. but he had a great career. And in my personal view, just to kind of end it off, Carl Froch, in my view, although I wouldn't put him on the same level as a Canelo or a Crawford, he is someone that, in my view, does deserve his place in history. He's one of the greatest super middleweights of all time. And he's someone that, in my personal view, you could debate on the Mount Rushmore for the greatest super middleweights of all time. Maybe not necessarily the most skilled or the most talented, but in terms of his resume there and in terms of what he was able to do there, he's definitely debatably there. Now, is he someone that I would ever say was more talented than a Roy Jones or more talented than an Andre Ward or a Joe Calzaghe? No, I don't think he's on those same guys' level in terms of talent. But you could debate that he's over at least some fighters that were great at the super middleweight division within history. But of course, when we talk about some of the greatest super middleweights of all time, you're talking about Canelo Alvarez, of course. You're talking about Carl Froch. You're talking about Joe Calzaghe, Andre S.O.G. Ward, Chris Eubank Sr., Steve Collins. I can't remember if Steve Collins, if he primarily fought at middleweight or super middleweight, but Steve Collins actually is another super underrated fighter that people almost never talk about. Probably because he was a Caucasian Irishman that, overall really didn't fight that much in the U.S., I don't think. But he was able to beat Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr., two guys that were looked at as British royalty and European royalty, two of the greater fighters of all time. So when you talk about the Mount Rushmore of super middleweights, to me, you have to at least include two fighters there. You have to include Andre S.O.G. Ward, who's probably the greatest 168-pounder of all time in my view. After that would be Joe Calzaghe. And then after that, you have guys like Chris Eubank Sr., Carl Froch, maybe some other guys. Now, of course, some people once again may ask me, where's Roy Jones? Where's that of James Toney? Well, those guys only had a few title defenses. And although Roy got a huge win over James Toney, and I think that James Toney got a huge win over Mike McCallum, I believe that it was, in the super middleweight division, Carl Froch, you can definitely debate, had more work there. And he got, several wins over A-grade level names if you want to debate that. So, I mean, Carl Froch definitely deserves his place in history. But I'll kind of end it off there. And in terms of British boxing history, in my personal view, he's debatably top 10 of all time for a British fighter. Just debatably in my personal view. Now, I'd have to really go through that, but in my view, it is a debate, but just to kind of talk about boxing history. But anyways, to talk about Carl Froch, he is debatably on the Mount Rushmore super middleweights in my view. For a British fighter, he's also debatably top 10. As for more of the top 10 for British fighters of all time, I mean, of course, you have either Lennox Lewis or Joe Calzaghe, in my personal view, who are the greatest British fighters of all time. That's kind of a debate between those two, in my view. And then, of course, after that, you have guys like Prince Nassim Hamed, Ricky Hatton, if you want to include him, although he didn't have as much accomplishments in his career. And I think that, probably some other ones that I'm missing. Chris Eubank Sr., Nigel Benn, Tyson Fury, AJ Anthony Joshua, even if you want to put them up there. I feel like there's some major people that I'm missing here, but I can't really remember at this point. There might be some other ones that I'm missing, but those are probably some of the greatest British fighters that I can remember. I know that there's definitely some one or two, key players that I'm definitely missing here, but I can't think of them at the moment, so I apologize. But anyways, those will probably be some of the greatest British fighters of all time. Carl Froch he's debatably top 10 all time. But anyway.
Chris Eubank Jr.
Really no need to mention this dude, but his father, of course, was a fantastic fighter. Chris Eubank Sr., I'm not quite sure if I would label him as one of the top 10 greatest European fighters of all time. Now, of course, when I say European, I'm talking about, from, of course, current day Europe. I'm not talking about Caucasian, or Caucasoid fighters like a Usyk or something like that. I'm just talking about fighters that are from the Europe region, including Caucasian, or other fighters. So when you talk about Chris Eubank Sr., his father, one of the greatest European or British fighters of all time, undoubtedly. He had several title defenses, I believe, at the super middleweight division. Had some big wins in his career, was a two-weight division champion, I believe. Chris Eubank Sr. was a great fighter. I don't think that he ever got super big in America, but for British boxing, he was an icon.
Felix Trinidad.
Felix Tito Trinidad, of course, anyone that was, a fan of Puerto Rican boxing growing up, I was, because not only did I have a certain amount of friends that were Puerto Rican, but on top of that, anyone that knows me knows that my favorite fighter growing up was Miguel Cotto. Now, I'm only 27 years old, so I'm not someone that grew up during the Felix Tito Trinidad era, but, I grew up more during the Miguel Cotto era. But Felix Tito Trinidad, in my view, although when you take a look at him, he's not as skilled as someone like a Canelo or Terence Crawford, but he is someone overall that deserves his place in history. Now, if you talk about Felix Tito Trinidad and where I would rank him, he at the very least probably would be within my top 50 fighters of all time. This is just my personal view of it. He's at the very least on the same level as guys like Miguel Cotto and Oscar De La Hoya and Sugar Shane Mosley and Juan Manuel Marquez. All those guys, in my personal view, are on the same level. And then right below them, in my view, you got guys like Eric Morales and Marco Antonio Barrera. I think that those guys are just slightly below, some of those other fighters. Although, you might disagree with me. But anyways, point being is that when you talk about Felix Trinidad, in my view, he won a lot of big fights in his career. And he was undefeated all the way up until he faced Bernard Hopkins at the middleweight division. And that fight was very actually comparable to that of Canelo Alvarez versus Dimitri Bivol. Now, do I believe that Bernard Hopkins was, probably more all-around talented skill-wise in terms of a Felix Trinidad? Probably, but the thing is that they weren't really that comparable in size. And this is why I always mention, that's why, for the Canelo and Dimitri Bivol fight, it's just hard for me to really compare, on the surface and just say that Canelo Alvarez, that he just completely lost to the way better man, very similar as what it was to Felix Trinidad and Bernard Hopkins, because that fight was very similar. Yeah, Felix Trinidad had ballooned up in weight a little bit to try and adjust to the middleweight class, but he really did not belong there. Trinidad was an exceptional welterweight fighter and also an exceptional junior middleweight fighter. He really never belonged at the middleweight division in the first place, especially not against the guy in Bernard Hopkins that at a minimum probably should have been at 168. It's no offense against Bernard Hopkins, but he was kind of a major weight bully at 160. Certain guys like Roy Jones and, James Toney and other guys like that, they're not real middleweight fighters. Those guys are super middleweight fighters at the very least. They were kind of weight bullies there. They could start off in their career there because their bodies are younger and they can kind of, wean themselves off a little bit more food and calories and just make it there. But they're not guys that, really belong there. They're more super middleweights. So Felix Trinidad, for whatever reason, he doesn't really get talked about as much, but in my personal view, he should get talked about more. He defeated Fernando Vargas when he was undefeated, and I believe that Vargas was possibly even the favorite in that fight because people forget that Vargas was the guy that had beat Winky Wright, I believe, and Felix Trinidad was known as the guy at times that would go down early in fights. But Trinidad, of course, was the guy that whooped Fernando Vargas' ass, and I don't think that Fernando Vargas was ever quite the same after that. But Felix Trinidad, although I wouldn't state that he was quite as skilled as a Canelo or a Crawford, to be honest with you, I don't even think that he's all around as skilled as what a Miguel Cotto was. But the point is that Trinidad, in terms of Puerto Rican boxing history, he's debatably the greatest Puerto Rican boxer of all time. Now, of course, you have other boxers there like Miguel Cotto and Edwin Rosario, I believe, and Wilfredo Benitez and, some of those other guys. But, the two Puerto Rican fighters, in my personal view, I'd have to look a little bit more into it. But the ones that, in my personal view, would be debatably the greatest of all time, it'd either probably be Felix Trinidad, Miguel Cotto, or maybe one or two other boxers. I'd have to really look. Wilfredo Benitez, in my view, although he was a great fighter, I don't think that I can ever really claim that he's the greatest of all time. He just lost too many big matchups. He did get that one great win over Duran, and that's a fantastic win. But first of all, Duran was really someone that really belonged at welterweight only at a maximum. And on top of that, Duran was someone that could be beat, even by sometimes A or A minus level fighters if you had great boxing ability. Sometimes he could be outwitted, and sometimes overall, he was just, not the guy overall that would always do very well against those type of styles. But, Benitez was a great boxer. He wasn't someone that I would really claim is for sure on the all-time great level, but he's someone that was a great boxer as well. But guys like Trinidad and Cotto, in my view, would be above him. Just in my view. But anyway, but Trinidad, as I stated, great fighter. When you take a look at him, didn't always handle quick feet well, didn't always handle excellent boxers well, but he was undefeated for a very long time. And like I said, in my view, just in my view, top 50 fighter of all time. Right there with Cotto, right there with De La Hoya, right there with Marquez, right there with Mosley, right there with all those fighters.
Oscar De La Hoya.
Better than Canelo.
Now let me talk about this one, and I know to a certain amount of people that this is going to be controversial, but for anyone that's known me on my channel for a while, you would already know my personal opinion about Oscar De La Hoya. Oscar De La Hoya, in my view, although he was an all-time great fighter, he's definitely one of the top 5 most overrated boxers of all time in my personal view. He was an all-time great level fighter, and of course what people are immediately going to look at and say is like, what are you talking about? He beat Chavez, and, he ended up beating Pernell Whitaker, and that's great, and those are two of the greater fighters of all time. But you were supposed to beat those guys. And the reason why I state that is because not only were, overall you younger than those guys, but you were clearly bigger. Now, of course, are there times where, the bigger fighter ended up losing to the smaller fighter as well, and I would consider them even greater than De La Hoya, like a Canelo, for example? Yeah, sure, but the thing is that Mayweather, in my view, first of all, is not only on a whole nother level, but Mayweather had at least been to 154 before. I mean, well, Chavez, to be fair, he had defended his title, I believe, many times at 140. But when you take a look at Oscar De La Hoya, like, he doesn't belong in no damn 140. Oscar De La Hoya is a guy that belongs at 147 to 154 at a maximum. So, I mean, you were supposed to beat those guys. You were pretty much a weight bully. You stood at 5'11", had about a 74-inch arm reach. You were really supposed to beat those guys. And on top of that, in my view, Mayweather, even compared to Whitaker and Chavez Sr., he's just on another level compared to those guys. Those guys are about a level beneath Mayweather, in my personal view. Some may disagree with that, but, you know, that's just my personal view about it. But Oscar De La Hoya was an all-time great level fighter. He did defeat those guys. But once he started to really fight guys that not only could handle his class, but also could handle his size and power and reach, he started having a lot more problems. That's why you've seen him lose to Felix Trinidad. That's why you've seen him lose to Sugar Shane Mosley on 2 separate occasions. That's why you've seen a split decision against Ike Corte, who's a great contender. I wouldn't call him all-time great fighter or anything, but a great contender, of course, for the day. You know, of course, he had a lot of problems even against Ricardo Mayorga to a degree. You know, I thought that he should have lost the Felix Sturm fight, although to be fair, that was one step up too far for De La Hoya. De La Hoya really didn't belong at 160. He really belonged more at 147 or 154. But the point is that once De La Hoya really started facing fighters that were similar in size, he really couldn't compete against them very well, especially if they were of his own same class. A Felix Trinidad, although many people would debate that De La Hoya should have won that fight, in my view, he kind of blew a lot of the final rounds because he thought that, you know, he fought too cute in that fight in the final part of the fight. He thought that he had completely won the fight and he didn't, you know. So, I mean, it's kind of his own fault. And then on top of that, Sugar Shane Mosley, who's a great fighter, all-time great fighter, but not on the same level as someone like, you know, overall a Floyd or anything like that, you know, or even a Pernell Whitaker or Chavez, in my view. He ended up moving up 2 weight classes, but because he was more comparable in size to De La Hoya than some of those guys, you know, overall he was able to whoop De La Hoya's ass. So, I mean, it just is what it is. You know, Sugar Shane Mosley always was a great fighter as well, but he was also someone that could be, you know, outboxed a little bit. Sugar Shane Mosley, Cotto, De La Hoya, Trinidad, Marquez, those are guys that could be, you know, probably within the top 30 to, you know, top 40, top 50 of all time. All those guys, wherever you place them, in my personal view, you know, you put all the names in a hat, whichever name you come out with is the one that you have, you know, 1 through 5 or however many fighters I listed. But De La Hoya was a great fighter, no doubt about it, extremely physically talented as well. But was he someone that is as great as what many people try to make him out to be? No. And to be quite honest with you, he really gets put over many fighters that he really shouldn't be. He shouldn't really be over fighters, you know, overall, like, you know, that, you know, like I see on certain lists, him within the top 10 or the top 20 of all time. There's no way he's top 10 or top 20 of all time, because any fight that overall he fought that was similar in size, that was against an elite fighter. When I say elite, I'm not just talking about elite, I'm talking about all-time great fighter. He pretty much lost. If they were similar in size, he pretty much lost. He lost to Sugar Shane Mosley. He lost to Trinidad. You know, he really was, you know, having a whole lot of problems with Fernando Vargas. And Fernando Vargas was a great talent, but he wasn't someone that was an all-time great level fighter. You know, he had a lot of problems against Ike Corte, other things like that. Now, of course, are there other fighters that had problems in their career, like Marquez and Cotto, of course, and Canelo even to a degree? Of course. But the thing is also with Canelo Alvarez is that at times, not only did he win usually the biggest fights of his career, although, of course, you wouldn't claim that some of the fighters that Canelo always fought were all-time great. But what I'll just personally state is this. I seen Canelo Alvarez beat Gennady Golovkin in the rematch. I don't think that De La Hoya would have been able to do that had him and Golovkin been really more comparable in size. And they somewhat were comparable in size. But De La Hoya was someone that, just in my view, he lost way too many fights once he started to move up the weight classes, which is the weight classes that he really belonged at naturally. He was someone that was a great fighter. Was he ever, in my view, more skilled than a Crawford or Canelo? No. And it showed in some of his bigger fights when he started facing guys that were similar in size. So there's a lot of people overall that make this narrative, especially about Canelo having trouble against Lara, trouble against Golovkin and some of these other guys, all this other stuff. Take a look at De La Hoya against Trinidad. Take a look at him against Mosley. Take a look at him against Fernando Vargas. Take a look at him against Ike Corte. Take a look at him against Felix Sturm. Some of those guys. Take a look at Oscar De La Hoya's career. He's not as great overall as many people like to pretend that he is. He's a great fighter, but, you know, his looks appeal, and on top of that, his marketability is really kind of what keeps him afloat during this day and age. He was someone that, you know, was very popular. He was the face of boxing for many years, but he was never someone, in my view, that ever was the legitimate #1 pound-for-pound fighter, nor was he ever someone that was as good as what many people try to claim that he was. It is what it is, and that's why, you know, he lost to guys like Mayweather and Mosley and certain guys like that. He just did. So, in my view, De La Hoya, He's not, any greater than guys like Mosley or Cotto or Marquez or Trinidad. They're all on the same level in my view. De La Hoya is not, he's not greater than them, just in my view. But anyway.
Manny Pacquiao.
And just to talk about Crawford and Canelo, they're a level above certain fighters like a Mosley and that of a Cotto and a Trinidad and a De La Hoya and a Marquez, in my personal view. They're a level above them. And of course, Terence Crawford's being silent as hell. Now, I'm not quite sure if he actually believes that Canelo Alvarez is more skilled or greater than that of a Pacquiao. But what I'll personally state is this: whatever you personally believe, Manny Pacquiao, my personal view, just my view of it, he's a top 10 boxer of all time. He's someone that, is at least on the same level as a Roberto Duran, someone on the same level as a Sugar Ray Leonard, someone on the same level as a Roy Jones. He's on the same level as those guys. He is a top 10 boxer of all time. Now, some people, of course, call him an 8-weight division champion. He's someone that is really more of a legitimate 6-weight division champion because 2 out of those weight classes, out of the 8 that he fought in, he really didn't win any of the 4 official titles. But, I mean, if you want to maybe count the IBO title when he beat Ricky Hatton at 140, if you want to, I guess, maybe you could say a 7. But the point is this: Manny Pacquiao was someone that was a phenomenal level boxer. When you talk about his resume, the man has wins over Timothy Bradley, who was pound for pound at one time. He beat Juan Manuel Marquez multiple times. He beat Eric Morales multiple times. Marco Antonio Barrera multiple times. Miguel Cotto, Keith Thurman. All these fighters that I just listed at the current moment in time. At one time, Ricky Hatton, of course, could have had pound for pound potential or were pound for pound when Manny Pacquiao beat them. And then on top of that, he really was able to win in weight classes where he was really legitimately smaller than some of those guys. He was legitimately smaller than Cotto, although there was a little bit of a weight drain there. He was a guy that was moving up in weight against Barrera and also Marquez. He was a guy that started off at lighter weight classes and actually could have probably fought there a little bit more in his career. Now, of course, many people say that it's a little bit suspicious that he was able to kind of pack on muscle and move up the weight class and still kind of retain a lot of that speed. But, I mean, and I would say that it's suspicious as well. But just in terms of a career, all-time grade level fighter. And he's someone that is a top 10 level boxer of all time. But Crawford is probably someone that is a little bit pissed off that Manny Pacquiao kind of avoided him for that fight when they both were the top rank or, with that of HBO. I get it. But Manny Pacquiao is an all-time grade level fighter, no doubt about it. He's someone that, in my view, is definitely, at the moment anyway, above someone like a Crawford or a Canelo Alvarez. And he's definitely over De La Hoya. No question about it in my mind.
Dimitri Bivol.
Better than Canelo.
The Dimitri Bivol and Canelo Alvarez fight, once again, is a little bit hard for me to compare just on the surface. And the reason why I state that is because I don't really think that Canelo Alvarez was at his absolute best there. Just like Trinidad, in my personal view, was not at his best against Bernard Hopkins. When you take a look at Canelo Alvarez, even just a fight earlier, he was way faster. He was someone that had better stamina. Now, Canelo has never been known as a guy with A-plus level stamina, but the thing is that Canelo had pretty decent stamina and was able to pace himself. When he fought Dimitri Bivol, it was just very obvious that Canelo gained a little bit too much weight and that he just kind of stepped a little bit too much up in terms of weight. He just really did not belong there. Canelo Alvarez is not a guy that belongs at 175. He's a guy that started off at 154. He probably belonged a little bit more at the middleweight division once he started to grow. But he was a guy that really, to be quite honest with you, doesn't even 100% belong at the super middleweight division. What Canelo Alvarez, to be quite honest with you, what he's very similar towards is one of the greater fighters of the very old generations that I would count, Sam Langford. That's really what Canelo Alvarez is very similar to. Sam Langford had a very similar body type, kind of like that of Canelo. Now, he was someone that I believe even started off at lightweight, at the early point in his career. I'd have to remember if, it was a different type of weight class back then. But the point is that Sam Langford was actually able to be competitive, all the way from, the middleweight class, all the way up to, I believe, even the heavyweight class at that time. Now, of course, the heavyweight class, is it, as, was it as big back then as what it is now? No, of course not. But the point is that Sam Langford, although he's a bit girthier for his size, kind of like Canelo, he's not a guy that in terms of body type really is above a middleweight or a light heavyweight. And Sam Langford was more girthier than Canelo. Canelo is someone that, definitely is a little bit more girthier for his size, but he's definitely not a natural light heavyweight. And to be honest with you, he's also not a natural super middleweight. That's why every fight that he's had at super middleweight, the guys have been clearly bigger than him. Bigger than, he was not as big as Caleb Plant. He was not as big, overall as certain guys like a Callum Smith, nowhere near. He wasn't as big even as a John Ryder. He wasn't as big, as, what was his name? William Skull, he wasn't as big overall as, some of the other guys there. He's really never been as big as any of the super middleweights that he's fought, other than Billy Joe Saunders, who was really more of a natural middleweight. So it just is what it is. Canelo also fought guys that were bigger than him in both Danny Jacobs and Gennady Golovkin. Keep that in mind. So that's also a part of Canelo Alvarez's greatness for me, is that not only has he beat a lot of A-grade level fighters, he's beat a lot of A-grade level fighters that, in my view, they're they're bigger than him, or they had, some sort of advantage over him. That's something that De La Hoya oftentimes, for example, could not really deal with. So it just is what it is. But I mean, when you take a look at it, Canelo is someone that in that fight against Bivol definitely has a lot of qualities that counter Canelo Alvarez very well, in my view, like great lateral movement and great feet, and of course a great jab and great defense. But it's a little bit hard for me just to say on the surface that Dimitri Bivol is the 100% better fighter over Canelo, because I don't think that Canelo Alvarez really belongs at that weight class. I mean, it just is what it is. Now, that being said, is Bivol someone that, is possibly similarly skilled to Canelo, and someone that I believe is greatly, greatly skilled? Yes, he is. And, you could debate him as an all-time great level fighter now after his victories in his career, even as short of a career as what it is. But is he someone that, in my view, is just way better than Canelo, or someone that is for sure 100% over him? I'm not quite sure if I can say that. And it's not that that it's not a debate. But the problem is that at 5'7", and someone overall, once again, that started getting belts at 154 and really could have stayed there possibly for a while, or at least at 160, and a guy that, as you can clearly see, isn't even as big as guys like Edgar Berlanga or Jaime Munguia or William Skull, it's very obvious that Dimitri Bivol, who's been fighting at light heavyweight his whole entire career, they're not the same size. It just is what it is. Bivol is at the very least a weight class and a half, and probably 2 weight classes bigger than Canelo. Canelo is more adjusted to the super middleweight division. That's true, but he really doesn't belong there. It was kind of like Trinidad at 160, but Canelo was so great that he can still beat fighters that are a decent amount bigger than him, even at this age. Whether they be A grade or more on the B grade level. But anyway.
Archer better BF.
But just to talk about Archer Beterbiev and Dimitri Bivol very quickly, in my view, they're about on the same level as guys like an Antonio Tarver. Now, Antonio Tarver, in my view, now, of course, we're going to get to Antonio Tarver, and a lot of people may, personally disagree with some of the stuff that I say about Antonio Tarver, but I'm not really quite sure if I would count Antonio Tarver as a quote-unquote all-time grade level fighter. And I know that many people would disagree. They'll say, what are you talking about? He ended up getting the victory over Roy Jones Jr. He ended up getting the win, over Glenn Johnson and some of the other guys. Right, he did get some very good wins in his career. But he kind of, in my personal view, just in my view, he kind of fought, certain guys that, either were beatable or guys that weren't quite at their absolute peak anymore. Like, he fought Roy Jones. It's no offense, but Roy Jones was not really anywhere near his best anymore. But we'll talk about him as it goes along. But as for Beterbiev and Dimitri Bivol, to me, they'd be very similar to someone like that of an Antonio Tarver, but in my view, probably even more talented than that of an Antonio Tarver. Antonio Tarver was someone that was a decently great fighter, but he was never someone that anyone ever took a look at and say, oh my God, he's a guy that is debatably the most talented boxer in boxing. Like, no one ever said that. He was very talented, and of course he was very known, very well known for that Roy Jones Jr. knockout, a Roy that very clearly had lost a couple of steps. And of course, he got a couple of other very decent wins in his career. But other than that, Antonio Tarver was not the most exceptional fighter of all time. Just my view of it. But Beterbiev and Bivol, they'd probably at least be on a similar level, in my view, to someone like a Carl Froch, possibly even a little bit over him. But I mean, that's up, to the eye of the beholder. But anyway.
Bernard Hopkins.
I'm glad that Terence Crawford also stayed quiet on Bernard Hopkins, because I also agree, in my personal view, I would place Terence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez over Bernard Hopkins. And many people, of course, would disagree. Bernard Hopkins was an all-time great level fighter. He was someone that was a great fighter, but when people talk about his resume is a little bit overrated in my personal view. He did get some pound-for-pound wins in his career. He got the win, I believe, over Kelly Pavlik when Kelly Pavlik was undefeated. He got the win over Antonio Tarver when Tarver got the wins over Roy Jones. Then I believe he lost to, I think the dude's name was Glenn Johnson, the Jamaican fighter, who already had like 9 losses. I mean, he kind of, became great a little bit later on in his career, but he still was beatable, clearly. Antonio Tarver lost the first fight, I think, by, split decision. And then overall, he ended up winning the second fight, I believe, the rematch, and that's when Bernard Hopkins fought him. But just in my personal view, Bernard, although he was a great fighter, he was not someone that was more skilled than either Canelo or that of a Terence Bud Crawford. And Bernard, as great as what he also was a dirty bastard. No offense. But he was debatably the dirtiest fighter overall that I've ever seen for an all-time great level fighter. I mean, the bullshit that this guy overall would, he would try to milk overall for point deductions, or possibly even disqualifications. If the punch overall would land on the belt line or a little bit too low, he'd try to milk overall for point deductions. He would use his head like a fucking battering ram. He overall would do so much dirty shit. Bernard was a great fighter, but he was a slick, dirty bastard. That's really what he was. And don't get it twisted. Bernard was someone that was a great fighter. But just to talk about his victories, how many all-time great level wins would we really state that he has? Now, don't get it twisted. You don't have to have this list of all-time great level names, in my view, to be an all-time great. But the point is that when people talk about Bernard Hopkins, they put him on a level that, in my view, kind of like De La Hoya, that he doesn't really deserve to be on. Now, I'll give Bernard Hopkins credit to this. He has been the oldest champion of all time, I believe, at about 50 years old, at about 49. But the point is that when you take a look at a lot of his wins, a lot of those wins were not over fighters that, first of all, were his size. A lot of his middleweight reign, although people kind of balloon it up to be something that it's not, people, of course, will state that a lot of Gennady Golovkin's reign was weak, for example, which, in my personal view, a lot of the fighters that Golovkin fought there, they weren't of the highest quality, but neither were Bernard Hopkins. When you take a look at a lot of the fighters that he fought there, other than Felix Trinidad and some of the other guys, he fought a few very good guys there, but a lot of those guys also were bums. You wouldn't even know who the hell they were today. And then the one fighter that he really finally fought there that had excellent talent and could actually compete with his height and his reach and his size against Jermaine Taylor, he ended up losing both of those fights. And many people, of course, would debate that Bernard ended up, should have won that fight and that he got robbed. No, he didn't get robbed. He lost both fights, in my view. The second fight, I believe, was a bit closer, but Bernard, in my personal view, deserved to lose those fights. He got outboxed. Now, unfortunately for Jermaine Taylor, of course, what we know about him is that, he was a guy that, always kind of underperformed. Other than the Bernard Hopkins fights, he kind of underperformed in other big occasions. He lost to Carl Froch, he lost to Kelly Pavlik, he lost to some other guys. But when you take a look at Bernard Hopkins, once again, in some of the bigger wins, you wouldn't say that a lot of those guys were unbeatable. Antonio Tarver wasn't someone that was unbeatable. He was someone overall that was a very decent fighter, a great contender, a great champion at one point in time, but he wasn't ever someone that anyone ever took a look at and said, oh, wow, top 5 pound for pound. Even if they did, no one ever took a look at it and said, wow, Antonio Tarver is just this generational talent. No one ever said that about Antonio Tarver. I've never heard anyone say that about Antonio Tarver. Even Glenn Johnson, who was a very dangerous fighter, he competed at the super middleweight division and the middleweight division. I believe couldn't even win the titles there. He finally won the title at light heavyweight, but no one ever took a look at Glenn Johnson and said, wow, this dude overall is just this, one of the greatest fighters I've ever seen. No one ever said that. And Kelly Pavlik, give me a fucking break. I don't think he's an all-time great level fighter either. All these fighters were pound for pound, and all these fighters were looked at as very, very decent. But when you take a look at a lot of the fighters that Bernard Hopkins fought, just in my view, they had a lot of the George Kambosos syndrome. And basically what I mean by that is that they ended up winning a big, big fight in their career. They still were A-grade level talented, but they weren't ever a guy that you thought was going to beat the best of the best when they actually fought them in their prime. Like George Kambosos was someone that got that one great win over Teofimo Lopez, but you knew damn well that he's not going to defeat Devin Haney or Lomachenko or, Gervonta Tank Davis or Shakur Stevenson. He's not going to defeat any of those guys. Antonio Tarver, once again, he got some very good wins in his career, but he was not someone that was unbeatable. He was someone that the blueprint had already kind of been laid out, and he had lost a fight, not too long before he fought Bernard Hopkins, and Glenn Johnson already had several losses in his career, overall, I believe. Now, to be fair, Bernard, I believe, did fight Glenn Johnson, overall. I thought that they had 2 fights, but if I'm wrong about that, someone correct me. But I believe that Bernard Hopkins fought Glenn Johnson when he was undefeated, I think at like 32-0. And he was very talented, but he wasn't someone that, I don't think anyone would ever claim was this all-time level great. I wouldn't. And Kelly Pavlik was someone that once again got those 2 great wins over Jermaine Taylor. But no one ever thought that Kelly Pavlik was a guy that was this generational talent. So that's what I mean. Bernard Hopkins, he was someone that was a great fighter, but a lot of the fighters that he beat, they were kind of the George Kambosos syndrome. They were guys that, got some big wins in their career that were kind of around at the right time. And they definitely were A-grade level fighters, don't get it twisted. But were they these guys that, were top 20 or top 30 pound for pound fighters of all time? No, it's not like he was beating guys like Marvin Hagler and Tommy Hearns. No, he wasn't beating those type of guys. He beat a lot of guys that were there kind of at the right time in my personal view. Now, he did also get a win over Winky Wright. He also was not really the same weight class as a Bernard Hopkins, but it still was a great win. The Felix Trinidad win, I've already kind of claimed my, thing about that. It really looked like a super middleweight against a ballooned up 154-pounder in there, but I mean, that's up to the eye of the beholder. That being stated, Bernard is an all-time great level fighter. He's just someone that's a little bit overrated for me. He's someone overall that is definitely a great fighter, but I don't think that he's in the top 10. I don't think he's in the top 20. I think that he'd probably be, somewhere around the top 30. Probably somewhere around Canelo's level, Crawford's level, Joe Calzaghe's level, Andre S.O.G. Ward's level. That's the same level that I would place him on. Tommy Hearn's level. All those fighters, in my personal view, are about on the same level. That's the level that I would put Bernard Hopkins on. But is he on the level overall of a Roy Jones or a Sugar Ray Leonard or a Mayweather, or certain guys like that? No. Or Manny Pacquiao? No. He's not on those guys' level. Because whenever Bernard Hopkins would fight guys that actually could compete with his talent and were looked at as generational talents and also his same size, he could never beat him. He didn't beat Roy Jones. He didn't beat Joe Calzaghe. He didn't beat Chad Dawson. He didn't beat, Tremaine Taylor. He never beat any of those guys. So Bernard Hopkins was a great fighter, but in terms of some of the bigger fights in his career, if they were looked at as generational pound-for-pound talents, he wasn't going to beat them. But anyway.
Floyd Mayweather Jr.
Better than Canelo.
And I agree with that. Floyd Mayweather Jr., not only in my view better than Canelo, but also better than Crawford. Someone that is debatably, in my personal view, the greatest and the most skilled boxer of all time, in my personal view. If you were to ask me who my personal lock would be for the greatest fighter of all time, it'd be Floyd. Just my personal view of it. He's someone that statistically has the greatest offensive statistics of all time, greatest defensive statistics, someone that, fought in 5 separate weight classes and actually fought guys that were legitimately bigger than him. Now, he was gifted with a great reach, but he still fought guys that at times would even be 15, 20 pounds bigger than him. So, I mean, I have to give Floyd a lot of credit for that. He also beat many greats of his day. Cotto, Mosley, Hatton, Pacquiao, Marquez. I don't think I would really count Corrales as a great, but he was someone that, for a time was, a very decently great pound-for-pound fighter. Not someone that I would ever label as an all-time great, but, very decent. And that's not even me including the A-grade level fighters that I would not consider all-time great, but that were great contenders or great champions. Marcos Maidana, Carlos Baldomir, Zab Judah, certain guys like that. I believe, Chicanito Hernandez or whatever his name was. Can't remember the dude's name. Can't remember the dude's name, but Floyd was a huge fan of him. And then, I think that he gave Floyd's, his first title shot. And that's why Floyd was, not only that, but he was a huge fan of him when he was younger. But Floyd also was very eternally grateful for that first title shot. Floyd beat a lot of big names in the sport. He beat a lot of big names in the sport. Manny Pacquiao, of course, how could I forget that one? Canelo Alvarez, he beat some of the greatest fighters of all time. Cotto, Marquez, De La Hoya, some of those guys. Now, of course, not all those guys were at the absolute pinnacle of their career, but they still all were, pretty damn close or at A-grade points in their career. Cotto was still at an A-grade point in his career. So was Marquez. So was Pacquiao. De La Hoya was probably more A- at that time, but he still was great. When you take a look, and other fighters, still great. Diego Corrales was pound for pound. Canelo Alvarez pound for pound. Canelo, in my view, wouldn't really be at his absolute peak yet, but he still was someone that was in his prime years and someone that was top 10 pound for pound. Floyd he beat way too many names not to be considered, an all-time level great, and someone that, in my view, just with everything that he has, he is, probably like the Novak Djokovic of boxing, someone that not only is debatably the most skilled and the most talented that I've ever seen for that particular sport, but someone that just has every statistic and the greatest resume that I've seen. So Floyd would probably have to be the number one fighter that I've seen, just in my view. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for this video. I just thought that was very particularly interesting. But just to answer a little bit more quickly, who do I think that, some of the top 10 fighters of all time would be? I think that all these fighters, in my personal view, have a debate within the top 10, to top 20 of all time, just in my personal view. So you have guys, of course, like Mayweather, Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Lennox Lewis, Rocky Marciano, although a lot of people would disagree with that one. But because of some of the bigger wins that he got at the end of his career, I mean, I'll kind of comment on Rocky in another video, but Rocky, although he gets a lot of flack, he did get some of the bigger wins in his career, and he did it in better fashion than what a Joe Louis did. And Joe Louis couldn't even beat all those guys all the time. But, we'll talk about that later on. Of course, you're also talking about other guys, probably like that, of a Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., Pernell Whitaker, Roberto Duran, Sugar Ray Leonard, Roy Jones Jr., Canelo Alvarez, Terence Crawford, Marvin Hagler, Joe Calzaghe, debatably, certain guys like that. Now, I mean, when you're talking about fighters more within the top 30, you're probably talking about guys like, Crawford and Canelo, they're at least for sure there. But you could debate them even as high as top 20. Some may even debate them as top 10. Now, in terms of comparing them to history to their countries, because that might be a little bit easier, I mean, for Canelo Alvarez to compare him to the history of Mexico, he is, in my view, debatably the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. He's at least debatably there. Now, of course, there's been many great Mexican fighters before him. Juan Manuel Marquez, Salvador Sanchez, Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., Barrera, Morales. But, other than Chavez Sr., I don't think that any of those guys are on the same level as Canelo. De La Hoya, of course, although he's more American. But, the point is that other than that, Chavez Sr., I don't think that any of the other ones really compare to Canelo Alvarez. When you talk about De La Hoya, in my view, he just lost too many of the bigger fights once he started to move up the weight classes. Canelo really doesn't even belong at super middleweight and light heavyweight, and he's still doing relatively okay even against fighters that are looked at as a grade level. I don't think that De La Hoya would have ever been able to do that, so it is what it is, because he was a guy that, once again, could have naturally fit at 147 or 154 pretty easily. So it is what it is. But anyways, that being stated, many people, of course, would also debate Salvador Sanchez over Canelo. Great fighter, greatly talented, but unfortunately, just in terms of accomplishments and achievements, I can't ever really put him over someone like a Canelo Alvarez, just in my view, just too short of a career. Although, of course, he had some great wins. I believe over that great Puerto Rican fighter, forget the dude's name. Maybe it was Edwin Rosario, I can't remember. But I think that was another Puerto Rican fighter. I think that I'm mixing up the two, but if I'm not, someone correct me. And then, of course, he also got a great win over Zuma Nelson and a few other great wins as well. But Canelo, if he's not number one, he's at least number two. In terms of Crawford, I mean, he's definitely not the greatest American fighter of all time, but I mean, he's up there. You could debate him top 10. When you talk about the greatest American fighters of all time, of course, you have guys like, Floyd Mayweather, of course, in my view, would be number one. Sugar Ray Robinson would be up there. Muhammad Ali, Rocky Marciano. I'm trying to think of who else. Roy Jones Jr., of course. Sugar Ray Leonard. And then Crawford probably would be someone after them. And of course, Bernard Hopkins, you could debate him up there as well. I'm not really quite sure who else you would debate after that. I'd have to really, really think about that. But those probably, in my view, would be the greatest American fighters of all time, just in my personal view. There might be some that I'm forgetting as well. Willie Pep and other guys like that, but I'd have to really go through the list. But anyway, both of these guys definitely are in a great class. They're definitely, some of the greatest fighters that I've ever seen. In my personal view, you could debate them even as high as top 20. Some may even debate them as greatest as top 10 of all time. And this fight, up and coming, in my view, is going to be very big for their career, because winning this fight could potentially mean, at least for a lot of people, that they could enter into the top 10, or at least that's what the narrative is going to be. So we'll see. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later. Let me know overall what you guys think. I know that a lot of people are probably going to disagree with some of the statements that I stated, but it is what it is. Anyway, but that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.